Good afternoon to all the participants and attendees to Focus Cloud's fourth webinar. Today, I'm joined by Andre Bajaria. Good afternoon, Andre.
Hey, Lloyd.
I am Lloyd Gordon at Focus Cloud, CEO and founder. Today, we're going to be discussing Workday projects and what to expect after go live. So the title of the webinar is Life After Live. So I'm going to open up the topics, Andre, and discuss your experience, and maybe you can give a little bit of an overview of your experience in the Workday market. I know you've got a number of years experience.
Yeah, sure, will do. So I actually started out as an electrical engineer and fell into this by accident. So my first experience was working with Oracle e-business suites and Oracle payroll about nearly 20 years ago now. And then after that, I worked for a small HCM vendor called Softscape, which at the time were a competitor for SuccessFactors, and that was around 2005. Yep. They became SumTotal, and then I think they're now Skillsoft. I also worked for a while for Saba, the learning vendor, before finally moving to Accenture, where I started working with Workday.
Yep.
So I worked for 2 years in the Accenture Workday practice in the UK, and then left that to start working client side. And for the last 4 years, I've been working with Workday customers, both on their projects, but actually I've spent more than half my time working with them post-live on phase 2 and getting over that post-live hump.
Yep. Going into when you go live on a Workday implementation, is very important to get the planning right, isn't it? So let's discuss, first of all, the internal resourcing needs of a project before you go live.
Sure. So I think a lot of the projects, the focus when you're going through it is you have a lot of definition all the way up to go live. You plan every element of it, you try and resource it properly. And then generally after go live, you'll have your hypercare period, and then one day your partner's going to leave. So it's being ready for that day. So, to start planning that very late, you'll suddenly find you'll run out of time, just because there's so many other things taking place as you go up to go live. So the sorts of things to think about when you're going through the project is who's going to be running this after we go live? Who's going to be responsible for it? What skills do we need? And how early do we start planning that? So some of it comes down to, working with your project resources, understanding who's going to stay afterwards. If they're people you've taken from the business to work on the project, is their expectation that they're going to go back? At the end of the project, will they go back to their day jobs, and all that knowledge they've acquired, will that be lost? So it's worth having a good think about, what you're actually going to need once your partner has left, and then using some of the project activities. So using things like the change approach, the communications, the training, and even having people more closely involved with defining test scenarios and even doing the testing themselves, because all of that it is a type of training, and I think the problems that people will find in testing, we'll get them into the right mindset about how to handle that immediately post-live period, and also on an ongoing basis, what should they be looking for? Can they break it? What can they break in Workday? And then having an understanding of how to fix it.
Yeah.
And I think in that period immediately post-live, there'll be things that will come up that, with the best will in the world, you didn't have enough time to test, or you didn't think of to test. So while you have that period of hypercare where you're working with the implementation partner who's just holding your hand through those first days and weeks, are you going to have them fix things in isolation and then just so things carry on? Or is that kind of the final cutover towards when you are on your own? So, how much of that fixing can be done with your internal team so they understand that when someone reports this sort of problem, this is where you have to look in Workday. And I think that's the whole process. It's not just looking at the particular issues. It's knowing, where to look in the system, how to find something on Workday community. I mean, there's so much stuff on there, but quite often you type in a search and you get 1,000 results back. How can you find the same problem that's the same problem as what you have, or what's close enough so you can leverage all that other good customer information to help you?
Yeah.
So I think, quite often this is looked at, quite late, and then there's a certain amount of catch up that's done, post live. So I think today, sort of the first point was really to have a bit of a think about, what can you do during the project to make this post live period more straightforward. And with the best one in the world, you'll never cover everything. There's the same resource constraints, there's the time constraints. In some cases, it's cost with regard to training. But it's really being able to think about how many things can be done while you're going through the project, so you're as ready as you can be when you launch.
Going back to the resourcing, I think in my experience, many organisations get confused about what they actually do need during their project. What would you say are the critical areas that an end user must have in this project before go live?
Before go live, so I think it's certainly having functional leads from the business who understand each of the respective areas. And I think I should just clarify. So Workday HCM is kind of my thing. So most of this will be based on what I've learned from working with Workday HCM. I believe it's broadly similar for financials, but if there's any financials experts on there that want to call me out on any of it, you're probably right. So other things that you need in the team. So I think it's being able to have people who understand the business, and then also people who understand the technology, and then understand Workday. Now, generally, the partner, when they come in, they can certainly provide the domain experience and the Workday experience, but probably not on the business side. And on the client side, it's they'll have the business knowledge, definitely, probably the HR functional domain experience, but generally not the Workday experience. So it's how do you bridge the gaps between those two skill sets so that you can understand what needs to be done, because the projects seem to be getting shorter and shorter, which can be a good thing. It also puts a lot of pressure on getting everything aligned. The businesses aren't getting simpler. So when you're trying to get people in a room for a couple of weeks and really try and iron everything out as to what your Workday solution is going to look like, that's a really difficult thing to do. So having people who are from the business and prepared and know enough about Workday to be able to answer the questions and understand what's being shown by the partner who provides a slightly different skill set is really key.
Yeah.
And again, you rarely get it right the first time. You might have a few hours looking at each module. You'll see demos. You'll see how things look on the screen. And all the time, people will be thinking about how does this relate to what I do in my day-to-day job? Is this something that we need to do? And particularly if you're not going from a single system and global processes already, maybe you're doing a degree of transformation at the same time, which just makes it even harder. So I think having some Workday knowledge within the business is a real help. So if you are recruiting people for the project, that should be a key requirement. If the HR team, just has people leaving and being replaced through the normal sort of rollover of staff, then to try and hire people in that have that Workday experience, because with the best will in the world, it's it is difficult to get a lot of these concepts and to get that design right without having that. So I think that's also important to be a message that's sent out globally, because if you're an organization operating in a lot of markets, then any help you can have locally, chances are you'll be attending design sessions in person if you're lucky, but in these days of COVID, I think more and more things will be remote. So trying to do a design session with a team on the other side of the world, maybe in a language that isn't your first language, how can you accurately, first of all, pass on what your requirements are, but secondly, understand enough about a demo that's being shown. Someone's walking you through it, and at the end of it, you're going to get back a workbook, or you're going to get back a design that's a big spreadsheet, and you're going to have to say, yeah, that will do what we need in Workday. And that's a really difficult thing to do. Yeah. So I think having some Workday expertise within the client project team is a big help to try and understand that and just help to get through that period.
Yeah, because Workday projects are obviously run differently to most other implementations, ERPs. So in my opinion, absolutely critical to get Workday experience internally, certainly at the start of the project, and definitely 100% before you go live. So to the attendees, I'd like to ask those who can to open up your video. Those who can't, not a problem at all. And we're going to open up the floor to questions for Andre. And if you can just wave at me if you've got a question. Questions. Paul Honeyfield.
Okay, can I just check? Is that a sound check? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
absolutely perfect.
Okay, Andre, I don't think we've spoken before, so I'm Paul Honeyfield. Pleased to speak to you, and Lloyd, good to speak to you again.
Yep.
Your experience, and I can see some ex-colleagues of mine in the background as well, so I'm under pressure here because they know me. Andre, what's your experience of when I see people saying we're doing a Workday program? It could be doing Workday, it could be doing IE technology, but it could also be doing a full transformation, a complete organization, shared service centers, redoing business partner roles, an Ulrich model. What's your experience of those type? You know, let's call it transformational. Keep it really simple.
Yeah. So I think, you know,
that and mixing it with Workday. What's your experience? What's your thoughts?
So I think, I mean, there's quite a few things in there, and I know we don't have all day, but I'll have a go in a few minutes. So I think that's absolutely a key thing of any of the projects or any of the clients I've worked with. Now, whether it's already planned out as you know, using all the steps and all the different aspects that you mentioned, I think that varies. I think quite often the starting point across the different parts of the client's business can vary massively. You know, sometimes you have you know, some parts of the business that are already quite well organized. You know, they're using existing systems, their data model is already in place. Chances are there's still going to be some changes. You know, just there's a few nuances about the Workday data model. Even just the real basics around the supervisory orgs and the managers being in the next level up is conceptually something that's new for a lot of businesses. I think a lot of businesses also, you know, to try and do everything at once is really hard, but quite often there isn't the time to actually do it to the degree that would be required. So I know there's some tools that Workday offer, particularly around the touch point diagrams that show these heat maps about what is difficult to change further down the line. So, you know, if you want to change some fundamental structures in Workday, you know, if you want to put everything in, you know, if you want to do six different modules in HCM and then change your job catalog at the end of it, that's going to cause you a lot of pain. So I think it's an understanding of the business of where's the happy medium. You know, you're probably never going to get to the point of having fully unified global processes, a global data model that everybody understands and can use, a degree of understanding about how to operate globally before you've even started the Workday implementation. Because even though having all those things in place would be perfect, I think that when you don't have that visibility and you don't have anything to help support, you know, alignment with those global processes, it's a really difficult thing to do, if not impossible. So I guess, you know, it aspirationally, I think it's what everyone should aim for, or at least have an understanding of all those aspects. Ultimately, Workday is only going to be the technology that supports it within the business. But again, there are a few things that I think is useful to know about Workday that can help to inform some of those sort of global transformation decisions. I think Paul's still on mute. I don't know if there's a follow-on.
Does that answer your question, Paul?
He's on mute, Lloyd.
He's on mute. Okay. Anyone else have another question before we move on to topic 2?
I've tried to come off mute. Sorry. Yes, you've answered the question really well. I've been trying to tell. I think what I got from there is, there was a key word there, was balance. Is trying to get that balance between you want to do everything versus sort of like the very limited time that some companies can have, and a limited budget as well. Yeah. So that's a really good answer. Thanks, Andre. Thank you.
And actually, just to follow on from that very briefly, I think that sometimes, even though you could allow more time to get more of those things done up front, there's always going to be changes once you go live. So I think at some point you have to take a view on, you know what, this is good enough, and then we can fix these things in the coming months. You know, to extend a project by 6 months, you're probably not going to have a 6-month better project at the end of it, versus going live when you'd planned to, and then 6 months down the line, you've had that time to pick it up and fix it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andre. Really good answer. Thanks.
Andre, I know we're going to touch on this in topic 2 as well, but I think it's really important to bring up the fact that I think that during the planning phase of a project, it's really important for end users to plan in the fact that perhaps this project may cause one or two of the team some issues, some burnout, and it's quite common in Workday projects that one or two people don't make it to the end. What's your experience of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it depends on how each customer is resourcing their project. So I think that most of them at the outset, they'll get something from their implementation partner, which will list the roles that they're expecting them to provide to sort of face off against the partner's consultants. And then within that, there'll be an FTE commitment. So, we need these people full time for the duration. These people are going to be 50% most of the time, and then full time when you're doing testing. And I think it's how each client manages that against people's existing workloads. So I think where it becomes the most difficult is where people think they're going to have to make a smaller time commitment for a particular period of time, but actually then that snowballs into something else, or when they're not released from their day jobs and they feel like they have to do both. And with the best will in the world, some things just take more time than you think. I mean, testing in particular always takes longer to define and execute, especially if you're trying to do it globally. Using operations people around the world, trying to make sure you fit around just things like if they're running manual payrolls, there'll be certain times of the month where people aren't available. And I think, trying to cover off as far as you can to have cover so that you're not just dependent on one person in one particular area. Again, that's not always practical. Some businesses don't have the people to free up, or they don't have the budget to devote resources like that. But I think, on the one hand, it's trying to plan as much as possible, working with your partner, working with the project manager to understand where the pinch points might be, where there are risks for resourcing. And particularly if you have multiple work streams that are all using similar groups of people, if the same HR ops team in a particular part of the world are providing data at the same time they're supposed to be training and also supporting testing, then even though each individually it looks fine, but actually when it comes down to it, these people are going to say, look, there's only 15 hours in the day, I can't do all these things at once.
Yeah.
So it's being ready for those sorts of dependencies and working out what is realistic and what isn't. One point I've seen which is sometimes really tricky is when you have a smallish country that maybe only has one or two people that really understand it. And maybe in that country, that person is the payroll person. They're also the main HR contact. They're the go-to person for all the business users who still have their needs and wants while the project is going on. And that person is really valuable to the project. So how can you pull somebody like that out of their day job for even for a few weeks to do a design workshop or to conduct weeks of testing? So I think just being aware of that, trying to plan for multiple resources so you do have some backfill. Chances are through a project, people are going to want to take holidays. So, the worst thing is when people have been under pressure for several months, you're coming up to go live, maybe something changes or someone had planned to be away, to have to ask them not to do that or to try and push it to after go live. You really don't want to be in that situation if you can avoid it.
Of course. Thank you. Any more questions before we move on to topic 2? No? Okay, let's try and change the... No, I don't think we've got any more questions. So let's move on to topic 2, which is what to do once your partner leaves. Throughout the project, you've had a Workday partner on site with you guys, and eventually they are going to leave you. What does an end user, what are the critical things that an end user needs to plan for when that happens?
So so I think it's again something that it's the white space of your product. What happens when you get to that end of the care and partner leaves. So sometimes you might have a phase 2 planned, which can be quite because you have that cushion. You have your consultants around for a little while longer. Maybe they're not the same, but at least you have access to the people. Another approach is that some businesses choose to have an AMS agreement in place with their partner just to help them through that first year. Again, it might be the same people that you get support from, but maybe it isn't. But I think particularly for your internal support team, the tricky thing is this is really the first time they've been on their own. Up until that point, they've had somebody on hand, either from the project team or sometimes help from themselves, or there's always been people around, and there hasn't been the same criticality as when something comes in that you've never seen before. Well, what do you do with it? I think trying to plan for that again well in advance, trying to make sure that people are ready for that they're expecting it is really important, and a few aspects to it. So one is, first of all, making sure that they really understand the solution well. And we did touch on this earlier about, are people going to go back to their day jobs at the end of the project? And if they are, then, how early can you introduce the people who are going to be supporting post-live to the system? I mean, ideally, you'd get them in at the design stage if you can, but at the very least at the start of testing. I think there's also an element of training that goes with it. And I think training is kind of tricky with Workday. because it is expensive and it takes people out for a long period of time. And ideally, people would be trained at the start of the project, because that way the design sessions make a lot more sense. But then a lot of time passes between then and when they actually need to use those skills on their own. And how do you retain all that knowledge throughout? So I think that's also to plan in for people that maybe haven't had Workday training before. If you have training credits as part of the subscription agreement, to make sure that you use those. I've come across a few businesses that had plenty left that didn't really use them, and almost got to the point as the clock was ticking down of, let's just put people on some training so we use them up, which, I suppose you're getting the information into the business at some point, but actually using them proactively and making sure the team from day one, are ready to go. I think if you are using an AMS provider, to be very clear on what sort of things you're going to push to them, and how you're going to measure the burn rate if you only have a limited number of hours. And I think also trying to make the most of knowledge transfer while you're doing that. So, if you have a question that you can't answer, rather than pushing it out and just getting the solution back, can you work with them to understand what they went through to fix it? And I think something that comes with experience is then seeing when maybe you fixed one problem, but you suddenly think, actually, you know what, I need to check these 4 other things that are similar to see if they all have the same problem as well. So I think it can be a bit daunting, and unfortunately it comes at a less than ideal time in the project. Everyone's been working up to this go live. You've gone live. If you're lucky, it's gone really smoothly. Your partner leaves at the end of hypercare and everyone's happy. Sometimes there's still quite a lot of pressure. And yeah, that feeling of being on your own when everyone else has gone has been, can be quite daunting, especially if it's the first time that people have had to do that. I think the other thing is quite often the teams that are expected to support it post live, they haven't been supporting Workday before. They've probably seen Workday, they've seen it in the sessions, they've done it from a testing perspective. But working from test scripts is very different to, having to get a ticket that someone in the business has raised that says, I don't know, I can't hire this person. They don't tell you who it is. They don't tell you which organization it's in, or anything else. So it's, how can you switch from that almost being not spoon-fed, but certainly being helped by your partner, to being the person who is the helper. I see Andrew's got his finger up.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Hi, Andre. Nice to speak to you again. I know,
hi.
We've exchanged a few emails across the way, and hi, Lloyd, and hi, everybody else. Just following up on what you've just said there, one of the things that I'm very keen on when I get involved in Workday projects, and I come from more of the service side of things, really, and ensuring that organisations post-go live are in a fit to run state, is service rehearsal testing. Mm-hmm. And one of those kind of things, one of the benefits I've seen in a couple of the projects I've been working on recently is the value of that learning, because I totally agree with your comment about the test scripts. When they're just following a test script, it's literally, you do A, then B, then C. It's all scripted for them. Where a service rehearsal test, where although it might come across as quite cruel, you're sort of blitzing the service team with a wide array of the kind of typical questions that they're going to get. It gives you the chance to validate where they're at in their sort of journey to being fully prepared. And also gives you that sort of chance to sort of mitigate any areas of shortfall where you can perhaps further push some training and stuff. So that's the kind of stuff I've seen. Do you see that? This is the question coming now. Do you see that on a lot of the projects you work on, or would you say that potentially there's a bit of a gap? Sorry.
I think on the bigger projects, yes, absolutely. I think on the sort of small to medium sized ones, I think it varies from client to client. I've probably seen as many that haven't. Or at least not to the degree that you're describing. And it's kind of been something that's been left to the last minute, and maybe it's even just something as simple as, do the ticket tracking systems work? Do we have a process in place where it can be managed? But yeah, no, I think, it is an ideal thing to do. And if you have the people and the resources available to do it and the time, yeah, I would certainly suggest it to any client. But yeah, I think some go in to do that, but I think there's a certain maybe a degree of maturity with your service model as well. If you've done several global projects before and Workday is just another one in the list, then you're probably used to it. You've probably been suffered in the past, and then this is the lessons learned from those projects that you know that you have to do it for Workday to make it successful. I've also worked for a few on a few projects where it was the first global project that was done, and unfortunately, Workday was the learning model then for all the subsequent ones down the line. So yeah, I mean, I think it is a mixed bag. Ideally, it would be done every time. The practicality of that, and also I guess the costs and resourcing that goes with it, varies from project to project.
Good question. Good answer. We've got a couple of points here on who picks up the work after go live, and you're probably leading on to that.
All right, I see there's one hand up from Sam.
From Claypole. Sorry, Sam, I missed you there.
Sorry, Sam, I can't hear you.
Sam, you're on mute.
No, off mute now, but I think the microphone's not working.
There we are.
Okay, there we go. Yeah,
we can hear you now, Sam.
You can hear me. Okay, I was going to make you lip read as well then. I just wanted to go back to the point Andrew made. I'll just briefly say I'm a test manager. So it filled my heart with joy, Andrew, when you raised the point. Yeah, thank you. I'd like to include it in my test plans for Workday. I call it operational acceptance testing. People like to take it out because they do not see the value in it. I always like to put it in, even if it's as simple as where you're going to route your calls, where they're going to come from, how they're going to get to your HRIS team or anything like that. People just don't see the value in it. So I'm really filled with joy that you'd like to put that in there, because it's not typically in the Workday testing model. It's not something that's there. So I am filled with joy that someone else is an advocate for it. I just thought I'd
and I think it's quite often people like yourselves who are the ones who and you're going to suffer if it doesn't happen, or you'll be the ones picking up the pieces. And I think quite often the Workday plans, they're very much focused on the Workday tasks. The support piece afterwards, maybe they're looking at how Workday itself will be supported. But even things like integrations that go out to provisioning equipment for people, everything like that. And it's always something, when you're playing catch up after go live, we've got somebody starting on Monday, they don't have a laptop, they don't have a phone.
They don't have a laptop.
And it's we told that we know the service desk needs 10 days to do it, but we've only done it today. Can you do it for tomorrow?
Simple things, and it's simple things like if your service desk is going to be the start of the call for you, what are the service desk going to do? Because typically what happens is service desk see, you've mentioned the word Workday, they route the call straight to the HR team. They don't even look to see what your issue is. It might just be it's something to do with the network, and they could resolve it. And there's a bit of ping pong goes on. So I've done implementations where I've put that in, and we've had a little dress rehearsal. We've been with the service team, we've put some dummy calls in, and we've seen what they do with them, and we've seen them route them round, so that once you go live, the service teams are ready, and the service teams go, oh no, I know it says Workday, but actually this is one that we need to route off to the networks team, or they can, typically, I can't log in, so they send it off to a different team to fix it, and they don't automatically end up in HRS queue. And when they do end up there, they've done a bit of initial triage, and so your HR team are not just inundated with hundreds of calls.
And actually, the flip side of that is quite often the HR teams, that when something comes through like that is actually related to something else, they might not have been that close to the integrations. They might not be familiar with what happens downstream when you do something in Workday. So I think being able to do that in advance and having, the expectation set on both sides can be really valuable.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I love doing that. So thank you. And you are the only group who's seen my lockdown hair. I was going to put that in the group chat and go, you want to put a video on with lockdown hair? Are you having a laugh?
There's another style here, Sam. You don't have to worry about it.
I know. Well, I did listen to your webinar earlier about you've lost your hair during lockdown. So yeah, great.
Well, I lost my hair way before that, actually. when I started this business, actually, a couple of years after.
That's your own fault for only being in London and Gatwick and for not coming north, you see. That's the problem.
I still would have had a full head of hair if I was up north, wouldn't I?
Yeah, you would, yeah.
If it helps, I'm up north and I've got no hair either. So hey.
There you go.
Anyway.
Don't tell him that. We're trying to advocate Manchester and Leeds here. Come on. Yeah. So thank you very much, Andrew, for raising that point.
So, Andre, onto training after? I know we've discussed training as well.
Yeah.
But can you tell me what, in your opinion, is the most important part of the training for what happens after go live for the end user?
Yes. So I mean, training is quite a tricky thing with Workday, because Workday itself is quite easy, I think, as a system. And quite often when you go live to begin with, there aren't really that many reasons to do it if you're not a manager and you're not in HR. You know, if you're just an individual contributor with no direct reports and no HR responsibilities, you only really have to go into, you know, if you have, say, you know, HCM, you only really have to go in if you move house or get married or something else. You know, maybe if you're using time off, you'd be making a handful of time off requests each year. Maybe if you're using learning, maybe there's some annual compliance training you had to do. Maybe you had to do some objective setting, some goal setting in your end of year review. But other than that, you're not going to be in Workday, you know, every day. So, you know, trying to train a whole organization on how to do everything in Workday in preparation for go live isn't always the right time for those end users. I think for managers, it's a bit more important because there's a bit more for them to do. You know, even just getting managers to understand a new job catalog, if that's gone in with it, you know, knowing which job profile to pick, understanding, you know, whether or not they need a job requisition when they're trying to hire somebody. I think that needs more, that needs a lot more input, but it's typically done through a train the trainer approach, where maybe the partner helps with providing training materials and running those initial training courses.
Yeah.
And then trainers will go out to the rest of the business and try and get the managers up to speed. And then the third bit, which is probably the most complex, is trying to train all your HR operations people around the world to know exactly what to do and what everything is and how to use it. And some of them have probably been used to using Workday through the project. You know, they've probably been involved with testing and they've seen some of it. And for them, it's, you know, it is more straightforward. But there'll be a lot of people for whom it's the first time they will ever have seen it. So I think the hard thing is trying to get that balance between spending a huge amount of time and money producing lots of very detailed training documentation versus just picking maybe the most common processes people are going to do, particularly for the HR teams, and focusing on those. You know, if people could do hire, change job and termination completely right, and they understand what supervisory orgs are and why the manager has to be in the next one up, I think that is a really strong start. You know, a lot of other things can be done through either super users. You know, if you have people in some of your regions who can actually go and help someone else the first time they need to do it, that can be really valuable. Again, super user training is another complicated thing to do, but if they're using it every now and again themselves, but also helping people a lot of the rest of the time, that can really help to cement that level of knowledge. There is also the Workday training, which I mentioned briefly earlier. I mean, it is relatively expensive in some cases, especially
the customer side training, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. The customer. So to send people on courses to understand particular functional areas really well.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's practical generally for a whole business. But maybe if you have a functional lead, or if you have a functional lead who has someone who works with them who gets into the nuts and bolts of Workday a lot more, you know, to have them go and do that training. And I think that if they haven't had it as part of the project, doing it, you know, shortly after go live is really useful, because at that point they've had a good chance to see it. Maybe they've fixed some of the go live problems. They're seeing the things that their co-workers are struggling with, and to then go and do the training with that context, I think helps it to land a lot more. If you're not used to Workday, or you haven't really seen it, and doing that training a long way in advance, there's a lot of concepts that don't really, they don't really land in quite the same way. Also, I did the consultant training when I was with Accenture, and I think then you get a very different experience, because you're very much absorbing, this is how Workday works, and the questions you get from the room are more around understanding Workday. I've also done some of the customer training with Workday in Amsterdam, and there you get a very different experience. So I did the advanced comp training last year with 18 other, 18 reward professionals from different businesses, and instead of just understanding how Workday works, the trainer would explain something, and someone will say, well, actually, in my company, we have this and we do it this other way, or we haven't found a solution for how to do that. So I think the conversations that arise from doing the customer training with Workday actually bring out a lot more practical solutions to things than you might find otherwise. So yeah, I think it's that balance between, what training can you do internally that is very much focused on your own solution, and then what training you go to Workday for, and that you schedule in advance and you plan who's going to go and do it, to hopefully use up some of those training credits rather than an additional cost. But really to make sure that brings the most value back to the business, so that when those people come back, they can leverage it, they can use that in their day-to-day work. They can help to input on everything from change requests to reviewing lists of new functionality that's coming out in new releases, and really just getting that knowledge embedded in the business so that companies can become self-sufficient with Workday.
We're going to touch on the changes in the new releases in the next topic. There are some questions coming through, and I'd urge the attendees to either wave or put your questions in the chat. We've got a question. I can probably answer this actually for you, Anjali, but I'll let you answer this one. Andre, any tips for freelance contractors who want to keep up to date with Workday developments, i.e. new features? This is such a poignant point, isn't it, with contractors at the moment in the ecosystem, while between contracts. So when your community access has probably been deactivated. So that's obviously when you've left your partner, for example, and you've decided to go contracting, and you're not, you haven't got access to community anymore. What do you do?
The Workday ecosystem is very tightly controlled. So like you say, if you're not with a customer and you're not with a partner, then you don't have access to community, you don't have access to the Workday Learning Center, you don't have access to any of the resources that come with it. Having said that, I think that there is a growing number of sort of Workday customers who are interested in learning from each other as much as they are from Workday and through those prescribed sources. I know that there's one group that run a thing called a sharing show that runs every couple of weeks, which is an online webinar where it is mainly customers rather than contractors looking to keep their knowledge up to speed, but it's people bringing problems and sharing solutions they've found to things. There's a back catalogue on their YouTube channel for previous sessions that they've run with people talking through solutions that they have shared. I know that Workday run a few events like the recent Elevate event, which I believe is a free to attend. I think it is more sales focused or more focused on prospects rather than rising for customers and altitude for partners, but that might be an information opportunity. They do have things on the Workday website, but again, I think that is more sales focused. So I think they're championing at a high level the new features that are coming out rather than the details of things that are coming in. And then I think there's also the user groups, if you still have access to be able to attend a regional user group wherever you are. Oh, and also the Focus Cloud webinars.
And the Focus Cloud webinars. I mean, that's an ideal time to keep up to speed, right?
Yeah.
Okay. We got another question from Ray McVigar. Ray, would you like to come on camera, or would you like me to read it out for you? Just wave if you want me to do it. You want me to do it, don't you? Okay. So, Andre, can you see that? Local country and end users.
Hang on.
Okay, so Ray McVicker asks, local country end users. Although company might deploy in English, end users' grasp of the language might be limited. Does Andre recommend that local POCs create local country docs for main transactions such as hire, change, or terminate?
As with so many of these things, I think it depends a bit on who they are and where they are. So a lot of the clients I've worked with, I've been fortunate in that everything has been done in English globally, especially at an admin level. Having said that, working with organizations, particularly in the Far East, in Japan, to try and even find people in HR teams who are fluent in English can be difficult. So I think you do have to do some local documentation. I suppose the tricky thing with that is, first of all, at what point do you decide to translate? Because there's always going to be a time delay from when it's finished and when it needs to be translated. And then how do you manage that from a change perspective as you go forwards? I think once you launch and you start using Workday in anger, invariably there will be changes. Business processes will change. You'll find things that don't work as they should, and you tweak them. I mean, that's the nice thing about Workday. It is quite user-friendly when you have to make a change. If you need to add a new step condition, or you find that there's some duplication and there's a step you need to remove, you can do that. The more documentation you have, the bigger the trickle down is of having then to update that documentation and then get it retranslated. So I think it's a matter of deciding, where you think the problems are going to be from your from your own experience within the organization, if you know that there's a certain part of the business that has a lot of organizational change, then yeah, maybe in that case it is worth doing. If you have, say, a part of the business where a lot of people don't have any English skills at all, then that is also worth doing. But I think it's worth looking at, first of all, what resources you have and how you can stay on top of that. Because the worst thing is you put a big investment into getting translated training documentation, which is then not maintained on an ongoing basis. One thing I saw work well with one customer was that they actually had the interpreter who had worked during the project kind of then took that role on post live on a part-time basis to both help help people to understand the things that were coming out in English, but also to compile sort of brief training documents, a couple of screenshots and a bit of descriptive text, just to help them understand and to do that. But yeah, I mean, I think it is a bit of it can spiral, because if you're doing it for one language, that's one thing. If you're suddenly doing it for 10 languages, then you have to do it 10 times, and that is every time you do a change. So, maybe have a think about, how good is the change governance within the organization? If you think that is something that can be maintained, then sure. I mean, and then I think the other thing is to review it on a regular basis. If you have a way to track to see which documents are being used, maybe you have a core group of users and you ask them, what they're working with and what they're not. And maybe they've got the hang of something and you don't get any tickets coming through and you feel like they've really understood it. Then maybe say to them, look, we're going to retire this document. It will still be available, but just so you know, it won't be maintained. Everything else is going to come out in the publication of the changes that are coming through.
Yeah.
Is that good?
Yeah, you mentioned there about change. It's so I've got a question for you. How many times have you seen it in the Workday projects that you've been on, where you go live and the end user spent a lot of money on Workday, making sure it's stable and everything? How many times do you see the users not using it? And why do you think that is?
So I think what you normally see is immediately after go live, there's a big spike, because a lot of people have had their welcome to Workday launch email. There's a link in it. It's easy. They click on it.
Shiny app.
Yeah, and I think after that, it then depends a lot on what you're using it for.
Yeah.
So if you don't have time tracking, and you don't have learning, and you don't have absence, I think you'll probably have a fairly low level of usage. But then if you had an organization like that with those sorts of systems, and you ask them how often they contacted HR, I guess that would be fairly low as well. I think the things that really drive adoption for non-managers are things like learning, where they have to go in maybe on a regular basis to do pushed learning, or global compliance training, or product training that comes out on a regular basis. People booking time off, again, is a reason for people to go in to get used to it. And also for time tracking, people that are doing timesheets that would go in every day. Another time when you see a big spike is when people are doing goal setting, and depending on the organization's approach to goal setting, if you do a sort of I'll not say old fashioned, but a more traditional, set your goals at the beginning of the year, do a mid-year review if you're lucky, and then try and write some words about it at the end of the year, you'll see spikes at those 3 periods when people are going in and doing that because it's expected of everyone. If you take the Workday advocated approach of having more fluid goals that can stop and start at any time, then again, that can help to drive adoption and to have people going in. I think for managers, a lot of it comes down to how much change they're having to manage and how much visibility they need to have of their teams. So I think, for managers, it's a bit of a hard sell to begin with. A lot of them see it as being, this is, why are we having to do HR's job? Why is this being pushed to us, whereas we didn't have to do it before? And I think to get their adoption is really that shift of mindset of, I'm not doing HR's work anymore. It's just easy, to be able to go into Workday and just do something and then it just happens. That can help. Also, especially the further up the organization you go, maybe they've had an org chart that was updated once a year before, but having that visibility to see all the way down through their business, see where people are. And then a lot of the stuff, for anyone that's been through any of the Workday product demos, they've got all these amazing reports and dashboards and metrics that come up that are linking commuting time to retention rates, things like that. You can't do that on day one because you don't have the data to leverage it. But as time goes on and you start to develop dashboards for the business and people suddenly see the value of the data that's in there, I think that can help a lot. Another thing I've seen done is where you have, I guess, influencers or ringleaders within the business, and not necessarily senior people, but people who get technology, and if they're the people who you can get on side to become someone who will champion Workday and say, actually, you know what, this is better than I thought it would be, or, oh yeah, I did this and I did it in Workday. They can kind of sometimes help people, other people think, well, actually, maybe I should take a look at this a bit more often. And one other area that I've seen is the use of notifications, and this can be both good and bad. So I've seen organizations that choose not to use email notifications and kind of force people to go in, which works as long as they do. If they don't, then tasks just sit there and never get done. The other side of it is you use email notifications, and suddenly people's inboxes, maybe they don't end up being overflowing, but they certainly get a lot up front, and maybe that tails off over time. But it almost removes the need to go into Workday, because you just wait until you get a link in an email, you click the link in the email, you do the thing you're doing, and then you close it again. So I think it's trying to balance all of those things. And also, if you're an organization that uses mobile, particularly from a notifications perspective, that can really help with persuading managers that it's easy. If before they even had to go into an email, open it up, take some action, do something, read something, if suddenly they get that on their phone and they're used to doing it, it can just, they're not even thinking about going to do an HR thing. It's just a way of approving something for someone in their team.
Yeah. So in Workday, there's a thing called an upgrade as well, isn't there? Twice a year.
Yeah. Seeing some people laughing at that. Yeah. So, and again, it's kind of what a lot of customers have bought. You've bought into this vision of having this system, which is, you don't have to do expensive upgrades anymore. It just happens. You don't have to do a major project every 2 or 3 years to do it. And the benefits of that is that twice a year, you get these major feature releases that come out with new things that are coming in. So particularly for modules that are, certainly not class leading at the moment. I think, anyone that's having to use Workday Recruiting or even, Workday Learning as it is now, it's not the top product out there, but every release they're doing, there's 20 or 30 new major features that are coming out, and that is twice a year. So in the context of what happens after you've gone live, chances are everyone's exhausted and needs a break, or you're trying to deal with all your post-live issues. And then if you do have a bit of peace, you just want to make the most of that time if you can. What you don't need is to suddenly be aware of that you've got this upgrade coming in 2 or 3 months' time. Every year they're in March and September. And Workday give you a preview tenant, I think 8 weeks before the production upgrade date. And before that, they'll start launching presentations and lists of functionality of new things that you can adopt. So I think to get the business in the mindset of this is always going to be coming and something that always needs to be looked at, rather than being a one-off, is a really big help. I mean, the cadence is twice a year, and there's a lot of activity in that 3 months run up to every upgrade, and then it's probably quieter for a while afterwards. But the problem is if you don't get on top of it straight away, you're then going to have twice as much stuff to do the next time around. Or maybe you're going live with your phase 2 then, and you miss that one as well, and suddenly you're 3 releases behind, and suddenly there's just too much even to manage. So you just try and take whatever comes next, and you miss maybe some features that would have been really beneficial to your business that you don't have. I think coupled with that as well is when you look at the time from when your design is effectively fixed. When you're planning your testing, you're doing your documentation, you're doing your preparation for cutover and your service rehearsal testing. If there's features that come out during that time, are you really going to have time to adopt them and get them into your plan? I mean, maybe if you're planning on going live around the time of a release, maybe there's enough time to do that. But quite often you wouldn't add that extra risk in. You don't really want to be working with a moving target. At the same time, that then means that when you go live, not only do you have the next upgrade to plan for, you also might want to take a look at the one that you've missed. Was there anything in that would have been really beneficial to the business? Now, Workday does provide some functionality in the tenant around how to track those. But I think coming back to what we talked about at the beginning around having sort of functional leads on the project, people who understand each functional area and that domain, and from a business perspective, as well as from the Workday perspective, how can they they then take this list of things, maybe explain to them by someone from the Workday team to understand what they mean, and say, actually, we want these 3 things to be part of the upgrade when it goes live. And that gives the team something to focus on and to deliver. And maybe it doesn't go live in September, but you plan to release it sometime after that. But I think getting on top of that process and understanding it just at a time when everyone's exhausted is a tricky thing to do. So if it's something you can plan for before go live, to take advantage of once you have gone live, I think it can be really valuable.
I think it's the choice of the customer as well, how they do the upgrade, and whether you use your internal team. We discussed the importance of developing your own internal team on a permanent basis. How important do you think that is?
I mean, I think, you know, every Workday customer should aim to be independent, you know, to be able to work on their own, and especially with things like upgrades. You know, it is going to be twice a year, every year. So maybe you don't have the people to be able to support that, but at the same time, then you're either going to be reliant on someone else to provide it, you know, through a third-party agreement, or you're going to miss out. And I think if you buy Workday, but you don't take advantage of all the things that you bought it for, then I think that's missing out significantly on, you know, on what the product is and what it can do. And I think over time things will become obsolete. You know, I think especially where there are these fast-moving areas. I know there's a big change coming for recruiting, I think in September, that will change the external career site. So anyone who's applying for a job with your company after that has happened, if you use Workday Recruiting, the first thing they'll see is either, you know, it's a slightly older looking user experience versus one that has like a drop-down bar along the top, and it just looks a lot more like what people are used to seeing on websites these days. So I think, you know, trying to stay ahead of it, I think is just really important. And if you don't, then you're still paying for it anyway. You know, the upgrades are going to keep coming. The new functionality is going to be there, but you're just going to drift apart from it.
Yeah, you could get quite behind.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Open up to the attendees. Any questions for Andre? Paul Honeyfield. Was that a question that you wanted to ask, Paul, or was you just smiling there?
No question, but I'm smiling anyway.
Yeah.
Andre, I know we've spoken a little bit about, I ask a question about data, please. Data is, someone described it once as blood. It flows around your body. Data flows around the business. It flows around using the technology. Have you had an experience of bad data? You may have seen that data right at the beginning.
Yeah. I mean,
go live, and what's your thoughts, especially with people who are protective about their data, can you say?
I mean, I think, you know, data can be really hard. And okay, well, I'll start with the best case I've ever seen. So the best cases is where there is already a global system, you know, maybe moving from, you know, SAP or Oracle to Workday, where there is an existing data model, and actually the data conversion is working with developers who are going to produce a report from the legacy system that will map it to Workday. And every time you want another data set, they just press a button and out it comes. You know, maybe it's not mapped quite right. There's a few things you have to tweak. There's some reference IDs that aren't right. But the process then is relatively straightforward in getting it in. I think the other end of it is where there are no systems. Every time people are populating Excel spreadsheet templates, you know, for people who have gone through the process of even just trying to populate information for a hire, I can't remember how many fields you need as a minimum, but when you look at all the sub-process and everything that's with it, I think it's close to 100 data objects. And if people are being pulled out of their day jobs to try and provide this data in a format to a very specific timeline so that the project doesn't get held up, and expecting, you know, to get it 100% right, and then understanding how it's changing from one iteration to the next as you go through the project because things weren't quite right. You know, I think that is a really difficult thing to do. So I think, you know, if there are data quality problems and it doesn't improve significantly from one round to the next, you know, I think there's, you know, you're probably not going to hold up the project for it. But I think, you know, there's things that you can focus on initially that have to be right. So, you know, making sure you get your reporting lines in correct, because, you know, you want to make sure people aren't seeing things that they shouldn't see. You know, if you think you're most of the way there with that, but you're not sure whether all the compensation is correct. You know, people have been providing annual compensation data, but with a monthly frequency. So suddenly it's, you know, it's way out, or the other way around. or the lack of understanding around a 13-month or 14-month period salary plan, so the numbers you get are incorrect. I've seen that managed through having a sort of a soft launch just to HR only. So maybe you combine this with if you've had to do a data freeze as you prepared for go live, and you've got a data catch-up period, maybe you also use that time before the rest of the business is in to do some data validation, to do some cross checks against the payroll system, to make sure that the compensation data is correct, to make sure the reporting lines are correct. I think the reporting lines in particular, I've worked with customers where we've literally printed out the PDF version of the Workday org charts that link from one page to the next, and actually sat down with their local HR people and the managers and just inked them up, gone through and said, no, that shouldn't be there, that should be reporting here, that's wrong, I have no idea what that is. And then going away and doing that as a cleanup before the rest of the business goes in and gets to use it. So yeah, I think when you have that sort of starting point where, with the best one in the world, you could ask them 10 times for accurate data, and you're never going to have the quality that you really want. It's, what's the next best thing you can do? How can you mitigate the risks of what's bad and what's good? And then how can you correct it after you go live without too much damage?
Great, thanks, Andre. Really good answer.
Okay.
I'm loving watching the faces and the smiles as you're talking about data there.
Any shaking
Andre.
heads?
No, there wasn't any shaking heads that I noticed, but it was interesting when Paul brought up data, because in my experience, data is one of those areas it's always neglected throughout the project until sometimes it's too late, dare I say, and then it's playing catch up on the bad data that you've realised that you've got.
Yeah, and I think sometimes as well, when the data you have can have quite a big influence on the design itself. If you're using condition rules and logic to determine things and how they appear, if people are providing the wrong value, or they think it's the right value, maybe even the people who have checked it think it's the right value, but actually that causes different system behavior. That can cause some problems. And you know what, even if you think you've got everything 100% right, there will still be things after you go live that every customer comes across that need to be fixed. I suppose in the ideal way, you'd find them straight away. You'd have your partner there during hypercare to help you through it, to do an extra eye load, or just help you do your first EIB post live. But yeah, you will also have things that come up maybe 2-3 months down the line where someone says, I don't think this is right. And the worst ones are things where you then have to unpick a lot of processes, make the change, and then put them all back again. Yeah. But yeah, customers go live on Workday. Nobody gets it 100% right on day one. But the sooner you can fix it, and there's tools and there's things that people can do, and then there's always external help, either from you get a Workday office hour to help them explain something. Maybe you work with your partner or someone on your own internal IT team around changing an integration or using EIBs to do a mass update. Yeah. But yeah, I think most things can be fixed eventually.
Yeah, I think that's ending us in quite a positive note, isn't it? I think the lion's share of Workday projects go swimmingly well, don't they? As long as you've got the right resources, as you've mentioned, the planning's done right. Most Workday projects are fine, aren't they? There's no issues whatsoever.
I don't think I've ever worked on a project where there's been no issues whatsoever. I think they all have their own challenges, but I think they all go live. I think where you end up might not be what you saw in that sales demo, or what someone saw in that sales demo back when Workday was selected. But yeah, I think it's just being realistic about where you're going to get to at go live, and then not losing sight of what you then need to keep focused on through the ownership of Workday, to make sure that you keep it up to date, that you fix these data problems, that you keep your support team in place. So people come and go, especially in the Workday world. So how do you make sure that you don't suddenly have a big gap in your organization because someone decides they want to go and do Workday for someone else?
Of course, the internal staff become a lot more valuable once they've got one go live. So that's something that an end user should plan for as well.
Yeah, but I think, having been on the consulting side for several years across different products, and for 2 years with Workday, I think you get a very different experience, because you're full on throughout the project, quite often long hours in the run up to go live immediately after, And then at the end of hypercare, that's kind of it. You're done. You know, you walk away and you don't really get to see what happens next. I've spent, I think, getting on for 3 years over the last five, working with customers and having to go through that bit afterwards. And yeah, seeing that, you know, how the different businesses learn to use Workday, you know, how they manage that period afterwards. And I think it's very different to that sort of solution design, you know, design workshops. This is a business process. This is how it plugs together. You know, I think there's a lot more about, you know, really understanding the ins and outs of the business. And with the best will in the world, the change management, the global transformation, the alignment of global processes, you can take it so far, but you're probably not going to get it all the way. Certainly not as you prepare for go live. So then how can you manage your Workday solution once you're live to make sure that you stay on top of all those changes?
Yeah. Any further questions for Andre before we end? Doesn't look like you've got any more questions, Andre. I think you've covered everything. So thank you for everyone for attending the 4th webinar. You will get an email, everyone, after asking for, yeah, thanks, Andre. You will get an email after asking for feedback. We do want your honest feedback. We do want to make these webinars better and better every single time. Our next webinar is going to be number 5, where we've actually got Sam. We've got an expert in test management on next, and also we're gonna talk about data in the next webinar as well. So that looks to be good. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great evening. Thank you so much, Andre.
Yeah, thanks, Sol, and thanks, Lloyd.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys.